Good morning. Thank you for joining us to discuss the climate change coverage. I'm Sophie Hewitt. I'm the Global Editor-in-Chief at Agence France-Presse, the global news agency operating worldwide with a network of 1,700 journalists. Last Monday, a lot of news organizations provided an extensive coverage of the latest IPCC report about the solutions to avoid a climate catastrophe. It was an alarming reminder that the clock is ticking, less than 3 years to halt the rise of carbon emissions. For the media community, it is another reminder that we have to raise awareness, to explain what transition means, and to hold the decision makers accountable. It was interesting also for me to notice that 24 hours after the IPCC report was published, it still was EFP's second most popular story in English, the third most popular in French, and it clearly shows a growing level of interest from the audience and from our media clients. Obviously, the top news at the moment was the war in Ukraine with the atrocities discovered in Bucha. But for climate coverage, a lot remains to be done. If climate change is the defining vital issue of our time, how can we make sure that we keep the issue on top of the news agenda, that we address the topic in a more systemic way? How are our newsrooms ready for the climate challenge? And how are we changing our organization, and what goals are we trying to achieve? Are we doing enough to fight misinformation and greenwashing? So we will try to address some of these questions with Urmi Goswami, who is assistant editor with The Economic Times, India's largest and most widely read business daily. She writes about climate change as well as issues related to the environment, energy transition and sustainability. She has attended international climate negotiation for more than a decade. We're also with Mira Selva, who is the Reuters Institute Deputy Director and co-founder of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, a new program at the Reuters Institute to help journalists and editors to develop their climate change coverage. And Kyle Pope is Editor-in-Chief of the Columbia Journalism Review. The Columbia Journalism Review co-founded the Covering Climate Now network with The Nation in 2019. The coalition now includes some 460 media partners worldwide and launched last year the Covering Climate Awards to honor the best climate reporting. For decades, the climate and environment issue has been a side story in our newsrooms. But more and more news organizations are now reorganizing themselves to cover the most important story humankind is facing. Let's have a first overview on how newsrooms are shaping their reorganization. Mira, could you share with us the findings of a research which has been one of the cornerstones of the foundation of the Climate Journalism Network?
Absolutely, thank you very much. Thanks very much for the introduction, Sophie. I'm Mira Selva. I'm at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and I do many things there. I'm director of the Journalist Fellowship Program and deputy director of the Institute, but also co-founder with Wolfgang Blau of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. All the roles I hold at the Institute have one thing in common, is that they work with journalists, mid-level journalists, so journalists with 5 years experience upwards from all around the world to face the challenges facing the industry. So they come together in different ways, online, in person, to learn from each other, learn from us, learn from all the various resources out there, to look forward and try and see what's coming in the media industry. And we wanted to take those principles and apply it to climate. And it started really with some research that we did at the Institute a few years ago as part of the Digital News Report, where we pulled out questions on how audiences around the world view climate change and climate change journalism in particular. And they were very striking, because what we found was that 69% of respondents said that they saw climate change as a serious issue. But when you break it down by country, countries like Chile, Kenya, South Africa, the response was much higher. It was about 90% of people saw this as a vital issue. Whereas in the kind of more prosperous Western countries, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Norway, less than half considered it serious. So this tells you something about the fact that there are big chunks of the world out there where this is not even a conversation that needs to be had. Is it worth covering? Is it important? It's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of how you're going to feed your children, how you're going to get to school, what your next job is going to be. So it's already about your life, and it's absolutely vital that journalism covers this, because it's not a separate issue, it's integral to everything that you do. And what we also wanted to look at is where people are getting their news, and this was really interesting because TV was still vital. 35% of people were still saying that they get most of their climate journalism from television, but again, it changes when you go down the age group. So for the younger generation, TV is much less important, and digital outlets become far more significant, and crucially, individuals become far more significant. Influencers, people they follow on TikTok, on Instagram, who might not even be professional journalists, but are messaging on climate. So this is kind of really important. And with this kind of data, Wolfgang Blau, who is a kind of media leader in several ways, he has back experience at Condé Nast, at Decide, at The Guardian, came to us at the Institute and said, can I look at climate change journalism, and can we look at what we need to do? And what I'll just spend the next few minutes outlining is what our thinking has been in the last few years and where we got to this point. It's been quite clear that this is a vital year for climate change. There's been several IPCC reports coming out in the last 12 months, a geopolitical crisis that again puts energy and geopolitics at the heart of global stability. And we have kind of social changes and social movements in all countries related to fuel unrest, food poverty, rising cost of living that's having very real effects on elections. So again, as journalists, it's quite clear that issues of energy, climate, environment are affecting everything that we do. But what Wolfgang had found when he looked at the issue of climate change reporting is that many newsrooms were still treating it as a future problem, as something that's coming down the line, as something that we need to deal with because it'll hit us soon, without really fundamentally thinking it's here, it's now. And again, it's generational. So there's a study by Nature that showed 18 to 24-year-olds were saying in their, 60% upwards were saying they were extremely worried about climate, about the state of the environment, about climate issues. The older generation were not. So again, it's just a kind of thing of when we talk about the crisis in media and the idea that we're losing youth audiences, part of the reason we're losing them is because we're not addressing the single most important topic that they are concerned about, and that is actually keeping them up at night. And so what we did then was, and what Wolfgang did really well, was spend a lot of time speaking to newsrooms, including AFP, including all the big news agencies and the big broadcasters, to find out where they were and how we could help. And what he found that there were kind of several blocks to climate change reporting. Part of them were operational, the levels of climate literacy inside newsrooms amongst journalists, but also amongst audiences. It wasn't really clear if there was, who knew what when we used terms like the Paris Agreement about net zero, carbon capture. Sometimes we assumed that people knew exactly what they were talking about, and sometimes we did very clear, simple explainers, but it wasn't consistent. And it's the same with the journalists. Journalists start using certain phrases without a fundamental understanding of what they actually meant, and we want to do this. There was also this issue of silification. So the idea that climate can be a desk. You can create a climate desk, and you can put resources into it, you can hire a team, and that's what they do. And what Wolfgang had been arguing very consistently, and what we're also finding, is that it can't just sit in its own desk, that politics, travel, sport, culture, entertainment, all are affected by these issues, and the journalists on these areas need to understand some of the concepts as well, and also need to be given the chance to raise awareness. You saw this with football, for example, where there's issues over the energy, the energy costs of flying football teams around the world for league games, and the energy costs of lighting up stadiums and cooling stadiums in the desert. And these are kind of vital issues, and they needed to be kind of embedded in the reporting of these sectors from the very beginning, not as a kind of add-on, almost when it was too late to do anything about it, when decisions had been made. And so what we wanted to also then do is take all these pieces and put them together into a climate network where we worked with journalists from around the world, with newsroom leaders, and with journalists both from kind of Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, put them together in a network that was a global knowledge-sharing network where crucially the knowledge-sharing goes in all directions. So we don't sit, certainly not at the University of Oxford, saying we will tell you how to do climate change reporting, but we will put you together and we will see what comes out of it and we will add resources. So this project launched in January, so we're 3 months in with the first cohort of 100 journalists, and it's been very striking to see how this is being played out, because what we have found is that there are a lot of journalists from a lot of the world who have been talking about these issues for a long time, but have not known how to advocate it in their own newsrooms. So key thing that we have found ourselves doing is saying to people, this is how you go to your news editors, this is how you go and say, I need to report this story. The other thing that's coming out very strongly is the kind of inequalities of access to data. So there are certain countries where they do not have access to data, and they don't have access, crucially, to the scientists, even to the IPCC report authors who might be from their part of the world, but whose media engagement tends to be focused on Western outlets. And it's been quite eye-opening to say that even if you have a kind of a scientist based in Bangladesh, of Bangladeshi origin, he's often not given enough time to speak to the Bangladeshi outlets. You know, he's
Maybe we'll get into that
yes,
later.
Absolutely.
Could you just explain the different approaches in newsrooms to, in terms of organization and operations to deal with climate change? Something that was in Wolfgang's research. I think that there are 3 different approaches with the climate, the science desk being involved in the climate
yes.
coverage, etc.
Yes, absolutely. So this has been a kind of interesting thing when we've seen with how COVID has been, how the reporting of COVID has evolved in newsrooms, and who needs to be involved in framing climate change coverage. What role do the science correspondents and the specialist correspondents play? And we have 2 things, and we saw this in COVID, that you had health journalists and medical journalists with deep expertise of data and statistics who were suddenly vital to all aspects of reporting, and they were used as a hub in many ways, and they're kind of, other journalists from other beats came to them to say, can we use your expertise? And there's a very strong argument for saying, do climate desks need to play the same role in newsrooms? Do they need to be the hub? And do they need to hold the data and the expertise that other journalists can then draw on? And can they be a kind of core integral part of how the daily news agenda is shaped? And the example Wolfgang gave was like digital transformation. So the idea that originally you could have a digital desk that did digital things and the rest of the newsroom would carry on operating the way they operate turned out to be completely ineffective. The digital desk had to be its methods. It's a general desk that tells everybody the basic principles on where to start their work. And there is a very strong argument that climate issues need to be covered in the same way, that there needs to be, every time you go out on a story, whether it's to cover a general election, you have a kind of almost a crib sheet that's come from someone with the kind of background to say these are the questions you ask about energy usage, about mitigation, about every single aspect of how this is affecting us should be in every single story and every single beat that a reporter covers.
Thank you. So, the climate desk. This is not exactly, Umi, the way you're covering climate, because at the Economic Times, you are covering the climate change on your own. So, how are you managing to do that?
Well, I used to think it would be great to have more people, but I'm beginning to think that the issue is not really about how many people, but how we cover it. And I think that's been a bit of a problem. I think by and large, climate reporting relies on tropes. We take the example of the closing hours of the COP26 in Glasgow. We talk about coal phase down and the change in wording from phase out to phase down, and we say India and China. But yet we know there were many other players, the United States, Australia, South Africa too, but they didn't come out very openly because they just had the deal. But when Russia, of course, had its own, well, they are a petro, coal, etc. state. Then Nigeria. I mean, I'm just counting the few countries that I can think off the top of my head. And yet when we look at all the reportage, we only see the 2 countries who are right up there up front. Except that few weeks after the COP, John Kerry tells in an interview that the US could not have supported the coal phase out, but had to go with phase down. He did drop some breadcrumbs on the first night itself. And so it doesn't matter how many people you had. We are not writing the complete picture. So when I see this, I realize that when you are a single person, which by itself is an issue, you make a priority list. What will I cover? What will I not cover? And the idea is to ensure that there is depth. Because the other big problem is that if we want people to focus away from any kind of finger pointing towards solution and creating pressure for solutions, you need to sort of give them enough information so that they can start creating that pressure. It doesn't become, I mean, if you look at, even if I stick to this COP26 example, there are many people in India who will say, see, it is about, the world trying to gang up, or China. I mean, you have China trying to say that, is the world ganging up against us. But that's not the case. There is a whole world with you, and you are just the front persons. If we are able to write that, we kind of blow the ganging up against us argument out of the water. And I think that becomes critical. It is not just about how we write. So the avoidance of tropes will only come from and it's not just about coal. I'll give you another example which happens a lot a lot more in reportage by the Global South. I know it happens in India when we write about climate finance. So the top line message is, developed countries are not paying up, they are not giving money. But we don't sit down and do a mapping of who are the laggards. I mean, yes, it's not enough, but within that, the European Union does a fair bit, and it does much more than, say, the United States or Australia. Why are we not sort of coming out and putting that? That, too, is part of the truth and part of facts that people should know so that they, too, can form their arguments better. So I think this business of relying on tropes has to go, and that will only come, yes, more people, a digital desk or a support like Mira talks about will help, but I think it's about our attitude, our decision to get more information, to write, to sort of borrow from the American phrase of, creating a more perfect union. I would say creating a more perfect picture of what the reality is. The other thing is, of course, priority issue. In the Global South, climate change impacts are not unknown to us, right? We have floods, we have droughts, I mean, just taking the big ones, right? Except now the periodicity has gone up. The average guy knows that this is a reality. He may not know the science, but he knows what is happening and how his life has changed completely. But the problem becomes in the newsroom, and I think this is where we need to get the issue of climate and its impacts into the mainstream. It is still a side issue, or if not, it's not a marginal issue, but it's a side issue. So I think, in a sense, if we have a climate desk, it is detrimental because we want to mainstream the ideas in. So there has to be a greater conversation. Climate change should be part of the foreign policy desk as well, because it does affect. But right now, I don't see any of that happening in India. I'm not saying elsewhere, but definitely in India. And so I'm not, yes, it would be great to have more people working on climate, but rather than a desk, I would like to see them through the paper, bringing the issues into each of these areas, because for far too long, and even now, we treat climate, environment as silos, as issues which are on the side or a separate issue. It is not a separate issue. It is part of everything we do.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, at AFP, we have this kind of hybrid organization mixing the hub concept with climate and economics specialists who are dealing with science and also with energy, transport, agriculture, etc. And we also, the top editorial management made clear also that this coverage is a crucial priority for every journalist, for every photo and video reporter included. And so we are describing this priority as the future of the planet, to make things very clear. So, Kyle, Covering Climate Now was created 3 years ago in the US, and it now includes a news organization from all over the world. Where do we come from, and where do we stand now in terms of visibility of the climate coverage in the US and elsewhere?
Thank you. Right, we started Covering Climate Now. We intended it as an American project because, frankly, the climate coverage in the US lagged Europe and most of the rest of the world. There was still a very strong sense that reporting on climate was somehow political. We spent a lot of time talking to newsrooms about why aren't they doing more, what do they need to do more, and partly this is a generational issue. The people running these big news organizations are out of touch with a lot of their readers on this subject, especially their younger readers. And they feared that if they did this, they would be seen as sort of siding with one side or whatever. We spent a lot of time convincing them that that wasn't the case, that their audience was really interested in this. We started initially, this whole project started with just a criticism, which was, I wrote with a colleague of mine that was basically, you're failing your role as journalist if you're not covering this story and if you're not giving it adequate resources. And that grew into a conference, and then we sort of had this sense of like, we can write this stuff and it may or may not be noticed, so how do we further engage the journalism industry? And again, we really thought we should focus on American outlets, especially American television, which is where most people still get their news. And we sort of went to people and said, look, all we want is more and better climate coverage. Let's put together a collaboration. We'll share ideas. We'll share content. So if your issue in your community is flood, we can connect you with newsrooms in other parts of the country that also deal with flooding. You can talk about what are the resources, who are the scientists, how to cover this, what are the solutions. And frankly, it just sort of took off. And we had hundreds and hundreds of media outlets in the U.S. and then now around the world. We have almost 500 newsrooms with an audience of about 2 billion people. AFP has been integral to this, and I got to say, Sophie, AFP is a real leader in sort of prioritizing climate among news organizations in the world. We do content sharing. We do events where we bring in people to talk to the groups. We do a lot of sitting down, and we take the same concept of like talking about it by subject with journalists from around the world. So wherever you are, if this is your issue, we'll connect you to people in other parts of the world that are dealing with the same climate issues. We do a lot of connecting of resources. So somebody in one part of the world is saying, we really need, does anybody know a journalist in Brazil? Part of the story is turning to Brazil. We can connect them with those people. And then as you mentioned, we last year launched a climate award with the aim of just raising up great climate reporting. And I think one of the challenges that a lot of newsrooms still face, and by the way, I agree with everything everybody here said about the problem of siloing climate coverage. One of the lessons of what I think has been largely excellent COVID coverage around the world has been that everybody's a COVID reporter. During the worst part of that, no matter what beat you were on, you had to cover COVID, because it was affecting every part of everybody's life, whether you're an arts reporter, a politics reporter, a crime reporter, a courts reporter, a police reporter, it didn't matter, you were a COVID reporter. And I think newsrooms learned that people can change and that they can adapt, and that centering science is critical to reporting. And I think there have been some really good lessons to think about as it applies to climate coverage. Making everybody a climate reporter. It's still an uphill battle. It's still an argument that is a little bit hard for people to take, but you're starting to see progress. Anyway, so we launched these climate awards last year. This year we just finished a judging round for the second year of it. We had 900 entries from all over the world, and it's an amazing, I got to say, we talk a lot here about how the climate reporting still doesn't meet the story, and I definitely believe that, but there is amazing, amazing reporting going on around the world, really focused on how the changes in the climate affect people's lives and how how they're adapting. I mean, just one of them that sticks in my mind. From last year, there was a group of radio reporters in Alaska that went and talked to people who are whalers. They fish for a whale, and they just talked to them about like how the whale movements and population is changing fundamentally. And these are people, it was an indigenous tribe that had been doing this for generations and generations and generations. And they are seeing on the front lines radical change happen in just the course of a few years. And it was completely fascinating. And there's some amazing work going on. I think in a way, our experience is that the journalists, for the most part, are eager to go out and tell these stories. The problem is their bosses. The problem is people are still saying, oh, well, that's a downer, we don't want too much of that, or we had a climate change story last month, we don't need another one. And so part of our job is to get the message to newsroom leaders that your audience cares greatly about this, your staff cares greatly about this, and if you're going to be covering journalism now, this is what you have to do.
Thank you, thank you. As you said, actually, we've learned a lot of lessons with the COVID crisis. Among them, we had to face the challenge of better covering science and improving collaboration between disciplines such as health and economics, and so now climate. But there's still a long way to go to educate journalists and to make sure the relevant scientists are heard. Mira, what do newsrooms need to improve their knowledge and method in science journalism? How can we attract scientists who are often reluctant to talk to media because they fear an oversimplification or they fear to be misquoted?
This is a wider question about what journalists need from scientists and what scientists need from journalism, because I think we've spoken to quite a lot of scientists and academics who have some valid concerns about the way they are treated by the media. And as journalists, I think we need to kind of address these concerns very seriously. The first thing that most academics and scientists have said to us is that we feel like when we speak to journalists, we're being pushed further than we want to go. So the journalists are looking for the next big breakthrough, the next big discovery. And most science works in tiny increments. And we need to accept that and find a way of telling the story without asking the scientist to say, this is revolutionary, this has never been discovered before, this has never been heard of before, and because most scientists don't say things like that because it's not true. And they for them, their credibility amongst their peers is far more important than their credibility amongst journalists. So they will rather not speak to the media than feel that they'll be misrepresented and then lose credibility amongst their peers. So I think that we need to kind of set up more spaces for dialogue between journalists and scientists where there can be knowledge sharing with an understanding that not everything is going to give you a headline. I think we also need to work at the way we present information in journalism. And we've got the tools now. We've got ways of doing data visualization. We've got ways of using images. We've got ways of telling stories with video and on social media that should be able to explain complex stories. And again, as Kyle said, we saw this with COVID reporting. There was just terrific data visualization and interactives and ways of explaining really complex situations and science in a very understandable way. And so just taking those tools and those lessons and applying them to climate science so that we can have the people who provide the information and the data putting their kind of knowledge into this machine, and the journalists taking that and presenting it in a way that's useful for the audiences without anyone feeling that uncomfortable or misrepresented along the way, I think is one key thing. And the other one is about deadlines. And we can't push people, both reporters and the experts, too far on this, because another one of kind of Wolfgang Blau's findings is that climate science unfolds over years and months and weeks, and we don't. But we report it when there is a wildfire, when there is a flood. But the circumstances leading up to these crisis events are really critical. But on a daily news agenda, very few newsrooms have the courage to say, we are going to step back and report on something that's building up very slowly, and it will become a catastrophe unless we act.
Exactly. Omi, do you agree with that? what could help to improve science literacy, climate expertise in your newsroom where people already have economic skills, but how do you make the climate a mainstream topic? And do you feel that your efforts are supported by the top management of your organization?
So I do think, yes, that the top management supports it, or let's put it this way, they don't object to it. But there is
exactly the same thing.
not exactly the same thing. Net effect works. But, as Kyle pointed out, sometimes it's the bosses that's the problem. As Mira was talking, I remember that several years ago, there was a standard story that would be expected that climate reporters would do around winter, when suddenly there would be a final rush of winter, which is just outside of the typical winter season. And I would be constantly told, ask the scientists whether this is climate change. And invariably, because I'd done the story so many times in so many different ways, and some of those scientists were people I kept going back to, they said, do you get the difference between weather and climate, right? And to which I would say, yes, I do, but I have to tick this box because I can use your quote from last year, but that's not great, is it, for any one of us? And so finally, one of these scientists said, do you think I should come down to your office and explain to your bosses the difference between climate and weather? So that's it. Mercifully, we have moved out of that stage. We now have understood the difference between climate and weather. But there are many new things that are there. The interesting part about this, from my own experiences, when people who covered environment, people who cover health in India are actually, these are what traditionally called soft beats. So we have constantly looked for people who will add to the credibility of our story, and nothing like scientists to add to the credibility of our story. So I think science, the place for science and many of our climate reporters were science reporters. So there is that, the place for science within the story is not such a problem. Yes, scientists speak in their own tongue, but I noticed that they're now making an effort to speak in our tongue, so that's changing. But I think the bigger problem we face is not everybody is open to thinking that, okay, how do I explain this to my bosses? So to come back to Kyle's point, the bosses are the problem. So how do I explain to my boss that climate change is important, because if we don't pay attention to this, then food production will go down, and therefore that is an issue. And how do I get this conversation in? And I'll give you a very simple example. Last year, there were these farmer protests in India, and the protest was about the change in farm laws. Now, why did we need change in farm laws? We have certain problems. This is people who have covered some idea of India and in terms of agriculture will know. We grow paddy in a state, in two northern states, which are actually not meant to have grown paddy ever. They used to grow maize earlier. And now, because paddy is a water-intensive crop, what's happened is there are many, many districts which have become called black districts. Basically, the water table has dropped so far below. And of course, the reason why it has happened are other political reasons, free power, therefore endless drawal of water, and so on. And so now we need to move, you have to take paddy, you have to cultivate what is best in a particular agroclimatic zone. But it is tempered by the way the pricing happens. So it's like so many layers of issues. Now, the farmers who have been growing paddy have been making a whole lot of money. And they don't obviously want to give up making a whole lot of money. And therefore, the protest starts. And then, of course, I'm leaving all of that out. But one of the things that they had an objection to was a clause that said that crop burning, which contributes to Delhi's air pollution in winter, will be a criminal activity. And they were up and arm against. While the conversation was happening, now the law has been repealed, but when the conversation was happening, the government agreed that, okay, we will take this clause off, because we need the bigger thing to happen, and we will, this is not the, hill I want to die on. There are more important things will happen, and this will get sorted out by itself. But what was surprising is that environmental groups, environmental journalists just slept through it. I remember because I had a fight in my own office saying we need to write an editorial condemning farmers, government, everybody for sleeping on this. We have basically agreed that it's okay to burn crop stubble. Now, that is a bigger problem. How do I get that conversation in? So my getting the scientists in has helped my credibility, but only to the extent that I remain in the margins. To get in, I have to make this transition, and I think that is a bigger problem. If anybody has a solution, please, I'm waiting.
Very interesting. Maybe we can switch to another challenge with Kyle. Sometimes journalists can feel discouraged by the feeling that the dice are loaded. The news industry is fairly weak compared to well-funded giants keen to manipulate using misinformation, greenwashing at a large scale. And journalists can find themselves being trolled online, being accused of activism. So how can the news industry fight back?
Let me take the last point first about activism, because this comes up a lot as it relates to climate coverage. And I always bring reporters back to some of the great moments in our country of coverage, where you had reporters aggressively covering the civil rights movement. You had reporters aggressively covering the lies that were coming out of official reports of Vietnam. You had Watergate. I mean, all these cases at the time were seen as quite controversial, and it was like, what are reporters doing here? And in history, we look back at them and saying these are some of the great moments of journalism. And so I try to keep people focused on history, that we have a role here. I think in terms of the sort of enormous public relations campaign that's been going on for decades and decades and decades from the fossil fuel industry, I think that is now, it's coming to, some of the tactics are now coming to light more. There's been lawsuits by states' attorney generals around the United States that have looked at disinformation. And I think there's just a little bit more awareness on the part of journalists about what they're arrayed against, although it's shifting. And I think you're going to see a lot of this increasingly now online. And I still think it's a battle, but I think journalists are a little bit more aware of it. I think there's generally poor education of journalists about how to deal with online harassment. Most newsrooms don't handle that very well. And so this is just part of that. But I think the journalism community is getting a little more sophisticated about that.
Thank you. Let's move now to the kind of journalism we want to produce to attract the audience. Journalists are used to report on the past or on the present, about facts that have already happened or are currently unfolding in a retrospective manner. This is what we are doing daily in our storytelling. But climate change is about the future, the short term and the longer term. So shall we change our lens? Shall we get some binoculars? We can, as we said earlier, base our reporting on current facts, such as extreme weather events, and try to be accurate with science-based data to attribute them to climate change. But how can we better use on-the-ground reporting, visual journalism, investigative forms to foster a more accessible and attractive journalism? So Kyle, with the Climate Coverage Now Awards, you're reviewing hundreds of climate journalism pieces. And what formats are the most persuasive?
Yeah, I don't think we need to think about the future. I think we can report on the present. Mm-hmm. It's merely the same point. Because the effects, unfortunately, the effects of this are everywhere and are happening today. I think the best journalism I've seen in this area, there's all kinds of stripes. I mean, people are trying all different approaches. But, one of them that sticks in my mind was there was a reporter, I think for The Guardian, who was reporting on what was happening with glaciers. And the reporter took a microphone and listened to the sound of the glaciers as they moved in ways that they hadn't moved before. And that was so compelling, because you can write stories about what's happening, but to hear it, and to hear it in a companion with the piece was really compelling. I think there's just, to me, it's really about the impacts on people's lives that I want to see centered, and that are the most compelling stories to me. And again, like, it's everywhere. I mean, you know, I grew up in the state of Texas, and where American football is a big thing. And I remember talking to somebody who was saying, for the first time ever, we can't practice in August because it's too hot. And I was like, that's a great climate story. And it's a little tiny thing, but there's hundreds and thousands of those little tiny things in all of our communities, and in everything that we cover, and in every beat that we cover. And those are the things that I think are going to sort of, one, they're great journalism, but they're also going to, I think, really stick in people's minds. That's that genre. The other genre, I think, is, you know, I mean, the Guardian, again, has been doing a pretty amazing series on climate crimes, and really looking at who's responsible, and how have they evaded responsibility. And it's been amazing, and I think it's something that people in every country can look at as a model for how do you think about how this applies where you live. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And actually, yes, I've read some of them, or seen some of them as a part of the jury, and it was just amazing. So, Humi, how much do you know about your audience interests in climate change? And so maybe you will have some examples to provide to us about interesting formats.
So my audience is interested in climate change. They react to it in their own ways. But I think the problem is that the reaction is not enough for them to act. And I don't mean in terms of just individual responsibility, which are little things, but creating that condition that leads to a greater issue. And I think that's where I would like to see a change. I'll give you a small example. We today are talking in terms of just transition all across the world. We have our own versions of it, or own texturing of just transition. And of course, clearly at the heart of just transition is the energy transition. And in India, surprise, surprise, it is coal to renewable. Now, there are many ways that the issue comes in, and it gets stuck at this. If coal goes, what happens to, you know, getting access to electricity for all those people who have remained unserved? So it creates a kind of a vested interest in, because you see, a person sees their future energy sort of access stuck in coal, right? So that creates a problem there. Then, of course, there are communities which in our part, and what would be coal country, where they're so dependent on coal, or rather even the illegal and informal and those in the pale of that illegal informal sort of economy, who realize that they realize what the terrible effects of coal are, but black lung or gas exposure, they're falling ill. It's not that they don't know. So it's not that they're ignorant. It's just that they have nothing else to move to. And that conversation needs to come into our climate stories. I mean, I keep coming back to this is because, in a sense, India is and many parts of the global south, I mean, I know South Asia, climate denial has never been an issue. It is about accepting that climate actually affects every part of our lives. And there is no order of priority. It is, I mean, Probably it's because we need to make that adjustment that you cannot say we will grow economically or everybody will get access to energy or everybody will basic amount of energy access or will have a job and then we'll talk about environment, because by then it'll be all too late. I think that is where the change needs to happen. And for that, maybe we need to be moving to more like the AFP kind of a model where, where you have a hybrid desk, where for whatever reasons, everybody comes back to either the climate people or they themselves become climate literate, if not conversant, at least conversant, if not experts, and get that question in to their thing. I think that's the big change that needs to happen. We do now do more visual stories, we do podcasts, and I'm happy to say, at least in my paper, we write way more editorials now on climate and environment issues. And I'm very happy that I have been at least able to get that done. But it is far fewer than I would like. So I think we still have a long way to go, but I think for developing countries, I know that's a huge generalization, so forgive me for making that generalization. I think the only way out is to show how it is the issue which will affect everything, including the overriding issue of eradicating poverty or having a better life. If we do not address this big risk, I mean, everybody, I haven't seen one leader who will not say, this is the biggest challenge of our time, but go back home and they do something, they'll do the thing, they'll talk about renewable energy, but what about transiting out of coal? What about starting to plan what you do next? These guys in coal country are not meant to be left behind. We can't leave them behind. So what happens next? I think that is where we need to be able to get the conversation. And we need to use every tool available at our disposal. Science, international organizations like yours or Mira's, everybody. I mean, we should be able to draw on everything to make that change happen.
And while we are covering climate change, eco-anxiety is growing. So how do we manage that? It's actually growing also within the journalist community, and there's been a lot of talk also about constructive journalism. Are there other options to avoid a sense of hopelessness, Mira?
Really good question, thank you. Yes, well, the last IPCC report kind of addresses this, the idea of mitigation. There's a lot of, work being done on this, and it's how it's framed, because you're absolutely right that, again, the thing that audiences make audiences switch off from the news is a sense of hopelessness, and this isn't just true of climate stories, it's true of all stories, that if there's a sense of powerlessness, hopelessness, people switch off and you don't get them back, and you end up with a kind of an unused community who you're not reaching at all. So it's really important to make sure that the reporting is not doom-laden, and so that you do need to kind of send out a sense of urgency and importance, but not have a sense of we're all doomed, because we might be, but it's not going to actually help. But also, I think there is a growing awareness of the importance of mitigation in both kind of approaching the kind of issues around climate change and also in how you report it. And there is also the strands of solutions journalism, which says, don't just come at a problem, kind of find ways that, people can resolve these problems. I think there's some concerns about what that actually means, and what it absolutely does not mean is allowing companies a platform for greenwashing. So it does not mean letting companies put out policies that seem eco-friendly and reporting on them favorably without really kind of looking at the underlying issues. So it's not about greenwashing, but it is about framing the questions in a way that makes it feel like this is a community movement. This is something that, like you said, it affects all of us, and it affects every single fundamental point about poverty, social justice, racial justice. Everything comes into climate change. So it's kind of making sure that all the kind of society, civic groups and social activists who are in this space feel taken along in this conversation. And so reporting like that. The mental health issue is really important, because what we're really seeing amongst journalists in our network, and I'm sure you found the same, is they're really affected by this. Yeah. It's very hard to stay on this topic and not feel terrified sometimes and alone. And part of this, our network, part of the biggest thing we've given to people is solidarity, a sense that you're not alone, that there are other journalists you can speak to. It's visible. I think newsrooms are beginning to slowly understand that they need to kind of provide more resources for their employees in terms of mental health. And again, I think COVID, you know, we've spoken about this, and I've done work with Professor Feinstein, who's sitting in the audience there, about the mental health of journalists during the COVID crisis. You know, that it was quite clear that it's a traumatic event it's traumatic to report on an event when you're part of it, when it's affecting you and it's affecting your family and your society. And so you're not coming in as a kind of independent, impartial, whatever that means, journalist reporting on something and then going away. You're sitting in it and it has an effect on you. And I think newsrooms are beginning to slowly understand that and try to provide support there.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Omi, I was about to ask you, how do you feel personally about this eco-anxiety?
Well, you know, I don't know about eco-anxiety, but I know there are many times I almost think maybe you should just roll over and play dead because nothing's going to happen. Yeah. But you know, you pick yourself up, and I feel it at various things. I mean, say you're at a COP, this protracted sort of argument, they did not do this, you are not doing this. I mean, you know, how long can you keep doing this? Like, get something done, let's get moving. And you say, okay, maybe we should just roll over and play dead. I mean, so therefore, that does happen. But there was something else that struck me, as much as I keep saying that we need to mainstream, and everybody sort of agrees to the bringing climate into every subject, I think there's a need to watch out for one more thing, is the possibility of manipulation, that in an effort to play up something like a climate story, one embroiders the other aspect. And I can see that happen often in many cases because, after all, a print journalist would want to be on page 1. So how do you get to page 1? And I'm worried that on one hand, I want everybody to be focused on it, but on the other hand, how do we safeguard? I mean, there has to be greater accountability amongst ourselves to avoid that.
You're
so that's
right.
the thing I wanted to.
That's very, very interesting. So climate change is affecting every area of our organization. It is systemic, total change of paradigm requiring to shift our newsroom culture. This is more challenging, as we saw, than just producing more dedicated content, more climate journalism. This is also expensive. We need experts, we need underground reporting, we need good visual journalism. So to finish with a stimulating perspective, could each of you provide one suggestion to produce a transformative effect in newsroom, if possible without extra funding? Maybe let's start with Umi. Umi?
Well, I would just say that even if we start with the climate reporter, let's start looking at whatever is the biggest priority of the country at that moment. So for us, so say in India or many other countries of the global south, it is how do we get our economy back on track in the aftermath of the pandemic. And we should be able to get our conversation to, and this conversation in sync. One clear way is, the fact is the pandemic or the COVID pandemic is a zoonotic disease. And we should go back to this whole idea. I mean, that's one part of the conversation that's vanished from the pandemic sort of discourse. We talk in terms of health, we talk in terms of economy, but where is the environmental piece? So I would just say that this is like literally a no regret, low cost measure, where we start, as climate reporters or environment reporters, we start injecting ourselves into the conversation in editorial meetings, in conversations with our colleagues, and say, okay, fine, let's do the story. You bring your side of the story, I'll bring my side. Let's do a joint story, you know, so that way nobody sees you're poaching on their territory. That's very important in journalism, isn't it? Yeah. So we need to sort of have that informal, collaborative system till we are able to force it in formal terms. So I think that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Mira?
Give every single journalist and editor time to read into this topic. Let them, basically, let them read the IPCC reports, let them join Covering Climate Now, the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. These are both free to join. Let them kind of go and look at what resources there are out there and have time to absorb them, and that for everyone to be given that time.
So it's more than something like 2,000 pages, the IPCC
Exactly.
report.
And that's only one.
Yes.
Yeah, the last one. Okay, well, what would you suggest?
I would seek out the people in your newsroom who are passionate about this, because they're there, and they probably aren't on this beat, and they probably aren't writing these stories, but I think it's a way to lift up especially young reporters in the newsroom into really critical beats. And I think that, I just think newsroom managers aren't being quite creative enough about who is doing climate stories, so that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. So maybe there are questions among the public? Yes. Speak just a bit loud so we can hear you. I'll just repeat the question for the online audience. So the question is about the impact of the climate coverage. I mean, it comes from a French media, and people in the newsroom say that these stories don't work online. Yeah, that doesn't interest the audience. So how do we do to attract the audience? Yes, sure.
Well, the best way of doing it is to bring it home. So how does it affect your pocketbook? How does it affect your health? You know, you would be surprised how much, I'm not saying that will lead to action, but it will definitely lead to interest. So more people clicking on the story. In India, air pollution used to be a story that wouldn't get covered so regularly. Now it is covered massively, primarily because everybody realizes how it hurts them. Has it changed people's behavior? I'm sorry to say it hasn't. But at least they're not walking away from the story. How does it affect your job? How does it affect the food that you eat? And I think just bringing it home, you know, the abstract, I mean, think about it. 10 years ago, when people wrote about climate change, it was what will happen in 2100. I mean, yeah, who amongst us is going to be around in 2100? But what's happening now? What can happen? What happened last summer in Germany could be happening this summer, hopefully not somewhere else. Or the fact that there's so many, I mean, we have, best example, I live in New Delhi. When I came here, when I landed here, the temperature was really nice, but it was 41 degrees C in New Delhi. It is still 41 degrees C in New Delhi, and this is not the time for that. So therefore, driving it home, how it impacts us, I think that's the best way. I mean, that's my sort of my experiential suggestion.
Kyle, very quickly, because we have one other question and 2 minutes left.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so you had a question, yeah.
Yes. Oh no, I forgot it. I'm sorry. Concentrated. Oh yeah. So a good journalism, of course, climate journalism needs money. And I have the impression that today there are a lot of companies that are willing to pay for journalism. And where do you see the keyword is here greenwashing? So what is your experience with this, and what do you think about this narrow margin between getting funding by big companies and supporting greenwashing on the other hand?
Yeah, so the question is about companies who are willing to pay to fund journalism, and so how do we avoid greenwashing? So, and maybe Mira, you...
Yeah, one thing is data. One thing we're really trying to highlight is a lot of the data that's available is being made available by the big energy companies. So the IEA, for example, has only recently decided to kind of open up its global data set. So I think one thing that kind of public institutions, governments, universities can do to mitigate this is to open up resources for journalists, especially in kind of poorer parts of the world where, with less funded newsrooms, so they can access data and go to the sources themselves directly. It's one part of it. And a wider issue about transparency in the media. It is a problem, and it becomes akin to native advertising or sponsored content. And I think media houses should be very, very cautious of it, because you will lose the trust of audiences in a heartbeat.
Kyle, do you want to anything to add? Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So thank you for your attention, and have a nice day here in Perugia. Thank you.